Hi, this is Dan Pertu, and I am so excited today to be talking with American and Canadian conductor Andrew Crust about what he finds to be inspiring about his work. And in doing so, we will get into a detailed conversation on programming, diversity, and what it means for an orchestra to be relevant. Andrew is in his third season as music director of the Lima Symphony Orchestra in Ohio, where he conducts subscription, film, pops, education, and other series each season. From 2019 to 2022, Andrew served as associate conductor of the Vancouver Symphony Orchestra in British Columbia and continues his relationship with that orchestra in the 22-23 season and beyond as a guest conductor. Recent engagements include concerts with the symphony orchestras of Vermont, Arkansas, Elgin, and Rockford as music director finalists, and San Diego, Calgary, Vancouver, Hartford, Winnipeg, Symphony Nova Scotia, Laval, and others as a guest conductor. International invitations include l'Orchestra Giovanile Italiana, the Hamburg Symphoniker, the Orchestra Sinfonica de Chile, and others. In 1718, he was awarded the first prize at the Kajana Academy by Daniel Gatti. In 2020, he was awarded a Schulte Foundation U.S. Career Assistance Award and will tour Spain with the Marriage of Figaro in 2023. Recent positions include assistant conductor of the Memphis and Portland Symphonies, cover conductor of the Kansas City Symphony and Nashville Symphony, assistant conductor of the Boulder Philharmonic, and assistant conductor of Opera McGill. In 2017-18, Andrew served as the assistant conductor of the National Youth Orchestra of the United States of America. Please join me as I talk with Andrew about what inspires him in his work. Great. Well, I am super thrilled to be talking today with Andrew Crust. He is the music director of the Lima Symphony Orchestra in Ohio and is had a varying conducting career, has also included engagements with the Vancouver Symphony and also guest conducting. And I am so excited to talk with him today about what inspires him in his career as a conductor, particularly with respect to music of the present day. So yeah, let's just jump right in with my first question. Why do you love what you do, and what inspires you about your work?
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I think it's going to be a fun discussion today. Why do I enjoy what I do? Well, I mean, when you first start studying conducting, you don't really know what you're getting into. I think we all have these ideas of we get to conduct Beethoven and Mahler and Stravinsky and all of these things, and it was very score centric, which I think is a good place, at least for me. I was really interested in this music. I wanted to program it. I wanted to spend my life learning it. But then I kind of realize now there are so many parts of this job, just as in every job, that you don't expect. And some of those things I really do enjoy, and some of them are not such a great fit. It's hard to find any conductor who can do all of the things really well. That's true for composers and for everybody. But I think I realized that, the tip of the iceberg is the performance, to use a cliche. Everybody always thinks about the performance and talks about the performance, but as you know, the majority of the work we do is in actually not even rehearsal. It's in solitary score study. We sit alone at our desks and we look at music and we read about music. And I think that's what drew me to it, actually, even though I didn't realize it, because I kind of figured out that you have a choice in music. You have the physical side of it, like an instrumentalist who spends so many of their hours sitting in a practice room mastering their one instrument. The downside to that being there isn't as much time to think big picture. And then you have the other side, which is perhaps conductor, musicologist, composer, where we spend a lot of solitary time thinking big picture and analyzing and going over everything we can. And it's not so physical. I think composer is probably the least physical, or musicologist, right? At least conductors have a moment to do something physical. But I actually appreciate that, because I do want to spend my time reading this music and thinking about it rather than drilling myself on program after program. You think about being an orchestral musician, that is an amazing job that they have, but very difficult. You're working on your Mahler 5 and then boom, it's over, and now it's time for the next thing, and you can't even reflect. So I think the general lifestyle of a conductor is something that is appealing to me, which is You work on projects. You think very long term and in advance. And of course, you get to decide the music that you're playing. That's the big thing for me. To be a section violist or violinist or something, you don't really get a lot of say in what the orchestra plays. And that didn't sit well with me. I guess I'm a control freak or something. But like I
Doctor
said,
who's a
there are a lot of
control
great
freak.
things.
Who would have
Imagine that, right?
thought? Well, no, that's you said a lot of really interesting things in that answer. And one of the things you mentioned, which and I don't know if any of my guests over the scores of people I've interviewed now have mentioned the things that are not a great fit, which I think is that's a fascinating thing. I'll confess, what's not a great fit for me as a composer is the fact that one day I realized, oh my God, I actually have to be a salesman too. I hated sales. Oh my God, I
Hmm.
hate it. That's one of the worst things ever. I never wanted to be a salesman. I wanted to write music. So and then of course, over time you figure out, okay, well, obviously I've got to do this. So how do I do it? And how do I do it even in an authentic way that I can get behind and not feel, scuzzy or whatever while I'm doing it.
Mm.
Can you talk about maybe something in the profession that, as a conductor, for example, that's just challenging and weird or difficult, or maybe something you don't really like?
Sure, I love this question. Yeah, I mean, composers have it the hardest, I think, in terms of really having to sell yourself. Of course, everyone has to do that, but nobody's going to be knocking on your door begging for music unless you're, you know, Arvo Pärt or John Williams or something.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Um, so that is part of it that I don't really enjoy, and you don't think about that when you get into school. And but there are so many things. I mean, a conductor's job. Some people are very naturally confident, and they step into a room. Like I remember the first time I worked with Marin Alsop, and she just owned the space. No matter what size of a room or how many people were in that room, it's clear that, oh, look who just walked in. Now, we know who's running the show here. And I exaggerate that a little bit, but people have a natural charisma. Some people don't. I've heard that, Claudio Abbado in rehearsal was very shy, and it took him a long time to get over this fact. And so one of the things I don't love is in rehearsal, you are in control of every moment of how the flow of the rehearsal goes. Every moment of silence, you have to fill it or not fill it. There's no resting for your brain. There's no time to just digest, which in a way is exciting and invigorating. But at the same time, I miss being in the orchestra and being able to just sit there and enjoy, for a moment.
Mhm.
So that's one thing. Of course, the administrative sides of being a music director come with many challenges.
Mhm.
I'm not lamenting the work itself. It's just sometimes you have to deal with the really hard questions
Yeah.
of personnel and of dealing with a donor that says, "I'm not going to give you my $1 million unless you program an entire concert of Franck's music or something." That you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there are a lot of outside voices, but I would say that the big thing is that you become an other,
Mhm.
in the orchestra. You are the leader. You are obviously the face of the organization, but at the same time, being a leader, you can't really be friends with everyone in the orchestra. Now, I don't mean you can't be friendly, obviously. It's just it's a challenging dynamic because you have to, in a way, stay professionally distant. And some people do better than others. Some people are married to people in the orchestra and they manage to make it work. So
Yeah.
there are many things, but I think in our world, when things go right, those things kind of overshadow the challenges.
So yeah, so let's talk about what goes right then. So let's talk about the music that inspires you as a conductor. Um, can what really is what you're passionate about?
I mean, so diverse, I think, is my musical interest, which I think most people are that way. It makes me very sad when I hear people, usually it's young people, but sometimes not, who are only interested in the music of their time. and they think, ABBA or the Beatles is old, and why would I listen to Ella Fitzgerald? That's ancient music. So to me, it's amazing because it's like you're neglecting centuries of music, literally centuries of music. And if you had been born in the 1880s, you would think Tchaikovsky was the hottest new pop music around, So you have to have a really long timeline, but I think it's very hard to be connected to today. Um, I don't listen to as much pop music as I could. You find your niche in your 30s or your late 20s, and you kind of stick with it. But I think overall, I like music from any time period that has clear intent. And I might be quoting Lydia Tarr when I say that from that movie Tar. There's the scene in Juilliard where she's giving a master class, and there's a piece that she doesn't particularly like. She thinks it has vague intent. Now I don't know about that particular piece, but to me, I really like music which has a distinct voice and the composer has something to say. As a visual artist, which I do as sort of a side thing, I
Mhm.
found it very hard to find a distinct style, and I'm sure it's the same for you as a composer. How do you find a distinct style? You have to either be lucky and have this random break, which usually you find out years later wasn't a distinct style. You just copied from someone and you didn't realize it. Or you have to work for years. And so for me to find someone who sounds just like themselves and no one else, that tells me they've spent a lot of time really digging into their own philosophy and their own world. So that can span, that could be from today or from 500 years ago. Um, those are kind of, I think, the key factors for me. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course that brings up an interesting question because on the one hand, there are some people who say, well, there's nothing new under the sun, right? Which that's I think debatable. But there are some music historians who say that Bach, well, J.S. Bach, there are lots of Bachs. J.S. Bach was sort of he was the best at what he did in that common practice, but of course his style was came out or even was derived from earlier styles. Certainly, you know, W.A. the famous Mozart or the more famous Mozart was sort of a culmination of different parts. So maybe it's a continuum of complete originality to being completely derivative. But there's I think, a lot of debate on that, and it sounds like, of course, you're valuing the distinct voice. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about influences, like how how a lot of composers, even great ones, do seem to be at least somewhat or at least have some influences, and what does that mean?
I think again we all have influences because I mean think about a personality that we put in front of the world. That's shaped by genetics, of course, but it's also nature versus nurture. So all of our experiences, all of the things we've ever seen, all of the people that have been close to us, what have their personalities been like for good or for worse? Every bit of music that composers are absorbing goes into that eventual output. And I think the main thing that makes a great composer is who cares who you're copying or who you're influenced by? Is it genuine? Does
Uh,
it filter through your personality and come out in a genuine way that's not practiced or doesn't feel like you're laboring at it. And everyone has influences. Picasso, I remember I saw an exhibition in Kansas City side by side with all this African art, very old African art. And he's just stealing like all of the, cubism and all of this new creation that he had. It just looks like these African masks, that were made hundreds of years ago. Or you think of Rimsky-Korsakov Scheherazade, which I just did, trying to sound like it's in Baghdad or something. He
mm.
doesn't really know. He hasn't been there. He hasn't hung out in the bazaar in Baghdad and listened to the folk music, as far as I know. Um, so nothing you create is truly original. He was borrowing these sounds from what he thought it might sound like. So I mean, it's in the end, it just has to do, I think, with, as I said, is it genuine? Is it yourself? Does it come through inner contemplation? Like you think of Arvo Pärt, such a distinct style, and the guy was practically like a monk and just decided, okay, this is not my style. I'm going to sit here for a while over the course of a few years and figure out what is my sound. And of
Hmm.
course, he's not creating it from scratch, right? So I feel bad when people look at, you know, composers and they say they've stolen too much. Well, there's theft and there's homage, and then there's sort of accidental. It percolates through your system and becomes part of you.
Yeah, I have so much to say on that. So, I mean, I think Stravinsky said, "Don't borrow, but steal," because when you steal, you make it your own, right? Um, and which I think is interesting, certainly apropos to all this. I think about my own experience as a composer. I went to school, undergrad from 97 to 2001, and then grad school from '01 to '07. And it's later than a time when, the serialists and the, Second Viennese School had their claws into everything in academia. Certainly at that, the '50s, '60s, and '70s, that was very, very strong. And I was sort of on the twilight of that. And nothing against my teachers or even the students I went with. But I remember as a composer thinking, and I even resisted composition for a while because I thought, oh my God, I don't know, I can't write music like that. I just can't do it. Like you were talking about Arvo Pärt, and he just did his own thing. And I even remember writing music for myself and then writing music for my teachers. and and it got me through and it was fine. And I don't think my teachers will watch this, so I hope they won't. But I wrote stuff sort of to because I thought, okay, that'll make them happy. But then I wrote the stuff that I really loved. I think nowadays, what is this, 15, 16 years later, I've seen in the new music scene a lot more of acceptance of diversity of styles. And certainly I think that's even been going on since the '80s, even maybe a little before, where, there isn't quite the same, at least academic, stranglehold uh, of high modernism. Again, nothing against that if you like that style. That's just not my personal style. And so, I think it's personally, I think it's a healthier environment for young composers now, where they can do what is authentic to them. And composition teachers now, I think, are being supportive of trying to make it best within its own internal logic. At least as a professor myself, that's what I try to do for my students. What are your thoughts on everything I just said? Did I poke a bear, or did or did what I say resonate, or what are your thoughts on all that?
I think it's absolutely right on. And I don't think anybody is trying to hide the fact that our industry has been full of problematic ways of thinking. And, you know, that to me is a gatekeeping kind of situation where we've decided these are the pillars of modern music, and this is like an established way of writing. And it's the same in any pedagogy. If horn schools or vocal schools or any school of thought that you have to fit into, conducting as well. And I think it's just a disaster when you have teachers that sort of quell that inspiration. And also, it's not. I mean, as a conductor, as a music director in particular, if I was just guest conducting, or if I was working just at a university, I maybe wouldn't care as much about the audience. But these days, I do think about the audience when I program. Imagine that, right? um, and the fact of the matter is, depending on where you are, the audience is or is not going to be able to digest certain kinds of music. And that's just because certain academic uh, areas of music, which I think are amazing. I mean, 12 tone music, Second Viennese School, I look at that like I look at a Calatrava or a Zaha Hadid building. It's the construction that is amazing to me.
Yeah.
Um, And I look at it and I think it's beautiful in that way, but does it need to be in the concert hall every week? I honestly don't think so, because we need to challenge people. We need to challenge people's ears and stretch their ears in new ways. But we also need to give them something that they can understand as well. And with certain music needs a lot of background information. Of course, other music doesn't. You just digest it and it's fine. And even if you don't know what's going on, it should be fine. Um, all that to say, I think now in today's world, you can't be pigeonholed. We're in a world of multi-creator sort of realities in pop music, certainly, but even in opera and all of these different things. You think about it, in pop, you used to have an artist, you know, whoever, Celine Dion, Michael Jackson. They would create a lot of the music, and then of course you would have a producer, and maybe you would have orchestrators and things. But it was more of a single person.
Hmm.
Now you have a whole team of producers from around the world who have never met. You've got one person making the beats in Finland, and another person, laying down a guitar track, who knows where. Uh, and that's kind of in the classical music world as well. We have these multi person projects, or you have someone like Johnny Greenwood, who writes classical contemporary music and yet is in Radiohead. So
Mm,
I think there is no one way anymore, and I'm so glad that's falling apart in all of our institutions. And of course, this also has to do with who can conduct, who can compose, all of
mm.
these things. We've just been too stuck in the past, which is understandable for an art form that most of the music we play naturally is going to be from the past, when the past is such a long period.
Of course. Yeah. So yeah, and you mentioned in particular um, programming with the audience in mind, which, I mean, as you said, imagine that. But that isn't necessarily always the case. I mean, Pierre Boulez in the with the New York Philharmonic sometimes programmed things that he believed in, regardless of what the audience thought. And it was sort of a provocative approach to programming. Um, that said, can you talk about what it means for you personally as a music director, um, programming with the audience in mind? How do you bring new music to an audience, or how do you bring an audience to new music? And what does all that mean? And how do you make it happen successfully?
Well, it's a big challenge in some places. In other places, it's not really at all. So again, it really has to do with who is your audience, what are they used to, and I've been in many situations where the audience really has no classical music or opera culture at all. Um, and so they clap between movements, which actually that's smart, because that's what they did in Mozart and Beethoven's time anyway. But
Yeah.
you can tell there's not a tradition there in their lives, and so you have to bring new music to them gently and easily, I think, and over time. And I always try and explain, especially when I'm music director, I'll bring new music. I like to open a season with new music. This last season was Vivian Fung. This season was what did we do? Is it Valerie Coleman? Well, that's anyway. Um, but you have to explain to the audience in this situation. Trust me, okay? I'm going to bring you new music that you're going to like. It might challenge your ears, but give me some couple of years here. I'm gonna expand your palette over the course of time. And so I'm not going to throw a 40-minute Xenakis piece at them right away. Um, I'm not going to throw a Nicole Lizet film at them right away. As much as I may love these things, you kind of have to ease into it. And I do think that speaking to the audience, so this is I'd be curious to see what you think, because some people are against it. I think with new music, most audiences really want it and need it, and it can be something very simple, a little nugget about the composer. I just did the Dino Wijeratana Tabla Concerto, great piece,
Yeah.
and to tell people that he's from Sri Lanka, and that he's, and a little bit about the performer's background. Sandeep Das, the tabla player, um, and what are the tabla drums? What are these sounds? Just a little bit of information can change everything. So I think it's important. You're always going to get people who say, "Oh, I did not like that modern piece and they're talking about Ravel or something, right? And you're like, okay, this is where we're at here. And that's sad because that person has decided this is how I'm going to think, and this is who I am. But just like an art museum, I think orchestras have a responsibility to not only show Renoirs or Rembrandts or something. It's a public service, right? So you have to provide all different kinds of music. Some of it people are not going to like. You go to the contemporary wing, there's always going to be a blank white canvas.
Yeah.
And that's actually my favorite to see because that, in a way, is just a litmus test. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's uh, the way people respond to that will tell you something about them,
Yeah.
and it's a reflection. So I think works like that are important, which challenge the listener.
Yeah, that's made me think about some museums I've been to too, and and of course, yeah, the conversation that can ensue. I mean, they're great conversation starters no matter what, and that's part of what artists are trying to do, right? Is to inspire conversation and inspire thought to or to transform people somehow or to move them emotionally. There's so many different things. Um, but yeah, I mean, uh, there's a lot of value in meeting audiences who are open to new things while also retaining the tradition. As you said, with the museum, you have different wings or whatever. You mentioned the issue of people talking to the audience and composers perhaps talking to the audience or conductors talking to the audience or whatever about a new piece. And if certainly it to my mind, it would depend on the composition, the context. Um, Personally, when I've been invited as a composer to talk with orchestras and their audiences, I've always been happy to do it, but I haven't always been invited to do that. Sometimes they just present the piece and maybe the program notes and it speaks for itself. Um, there is one piece I have though that is a very programmatic piece. So when it's programmatic, when it isn't so abstract or whatever, and and it's more dependent on, like, it's my piano concerto based on the planets, which yes, we know Holst did that, but I think the world was ready for a piano concerto now based on that, not just a symphonic suite. And with that piece, I think it's really important to have the visual slides um, showing which variation corresponds to which planet. And the program notes are very important to that piece. So, because it's based on current knowledge, current scientific knowledge of what's going on in the planets, as opposed to the astrology that the Holst did. And so, to answer the issue or to consider the issue that you brought up, the context is so important. Um, Whereas something like, I don't know, maybe a piece by Xenakis or whatever, or maybe a piece that doesn't even have a program note, if your audience is ready for it, then it's just presented, boom, as is, right? So
Mm.
there's a it's a context thing, and I think it is also an audience. I mean, maybe there's a place though for the conductor, depending on the audience, to introduce it as, okay, well, this piece is meant to stand on its own. It has no program, and that's it. And then you move on
Mm.
to talk about Brahms 4 or whatever. um, but yeah, I think it's considering this, there's such a wonderful stylistic diversity of music, aesthetic orientations out there, and audiences that you talk about, you develop trust with. So how do you develop that trust? Can you talk maybe a little bit more about the whole trust developing process and bringing audiences along and what you do?
Well, I think the first concert I did as music director of the Lima Symphony, for example, I kind of treated that as a little taste of what was to come during my tenure. So I had a Vivian Fung piece, brand new, like a year old, and then I had a Poulenc, the double piano concerto, and then I had Beethoven 5, I think was the program, if I remember correctly. So my idea was I'm going to give you something entirely new that you've never heard, but you're going to like. and it was very relevant to today. That's the other thing, is people don't immediately understand the nuances of a 17th century opera about some king in some other language they don't speak. Now, the music may make a lot of sense to them, but the subject matter doesn't. And so, even if you stretch the musical uh, vocabulary a little bit beyond their comfort zone, but it's about something they understand, then that helps. So that's one reason contemporary music is actually more palatable for some people. But I digress. So my point in that was to give you something new. I give you something that's established, but they may not know, but is a masterwork. So that's something I plan to do. And then a big warhorse. And so the idea is that this is what you're going to get. Okay, I'm going to give you some new things. I'm going to give you some hidden gems,
Hmm.
and then I'm going to give you what you want. Okay, so you start to build trust, and every time you bring a new piece, you you just ascertain, does it need to be spoken about or not. Next week, I'm doing a sort of a minimalist piece by Jocelyn Morlock, who's a British Columbian composer here. I'm doing it 3 times in the U.S. this year, actually, and I don't think it needs really any words. It's just a beautiful piece of music. So it really just does depend, but I think I think you do need to talk a little bit, and of course having the composer there or having them on a video is really great. And I will say to any composers listening who are young, practice that just like you study for hours and hours orchestration and all of these things, because I'm going to be real with you right now. Composers are not always the best public speakers.
Yeah, you're not the only
So
conductor who said that.
it's important, and that's maybe why sometimes people are afraid to invite a composer. As much as we love that composer and we think they are brilliant, it's just not something people always spend as much time on. And of course, again, just like a conductor has, some people have natural predilections. Some composers can just step up and be great on stage. Other ones will go up and maybe they're not shy or uncomfortable, but maybe they're talking about the wrong thing. So they're talking about the minutia of their process and
Yeah.
the pitch class set that developed this, whatever. So find the things that people really want to know, and of
Hmm.
course know your audience. If you're at a new music conference, sure. If you're in Boise, Idaho, think twice about going
Maybe,
in depth.
yeah, maybe a pitch class set is like a mosquito or something. You don't want to do that. Yeah. Um, you also mentioned the issue of relevance. So, and it sounded like that was something that was important. So the issue of how do you choose music and perform music, particularly new music, that is relevant to your given audience, and what does that actually mean, and what does that mean to you? And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm torn between this idea, because of course you play a Tchaikovsky piece, a Brahms piece, whatever, you understand it's relevant, even if you don't know anything about them. The harmonies and the tension and release and all of these things that we innately understand are there. So that's why I think Mozart and all these people are relevant so many years later, and every great work of art, that is the hallmark of a great work of art. Does it remain relevant throughout time? Now, of course, something like a Beethoven symphony is abstract, so it's pretty easy to remain relevant. It's just, what are the emotions and feelings that are coming through this? But if it's programmatic, or if it's an opera about Julius Caesar, or even some Mozart and Handel and things that are so tied up. I mean, these were made to be performed in that day. They weren't thinking about 200, 300 years later. They were thinking about, what is my audience like now? How do I make them laugh? How do I make inside jokes about the aristocracy and all of these things? That's very hard for the average person to understand unless you grew up in this culture.
Yeah.
Um, so that's not relevant to us today, unless you're going to be doing a little research before you go in. That doesn't mean it's not going to be a great story. Well, honestly, I think a lot of opera does not have a great story. It has great music, but honestly, I think a lot of it is full of cliches that made sense at the time, that were hilarious at the time. But today, I mean, how many operas do you like disguise yourself really poorly, and the woman thinks you're her husband, and but you actually fall in love, and then someone gets stabbed and yet they still sing an entire aria. great music, but it's like this was like the sitcoms of the days. You just put this stuff out. It was effective. We had an equation that made it really work.
Yeah.
So I think relevance. What about a cantata about global warming, climate change? What about a cantata about George Floyd? Or I mentioned Nicole Lizet. I don't know if you know her music. She does this thing where she takes movies or film and she edits them and cuts them up, and actually the sounds in the film. We did a piece called uh, Perksploitation. It's a percussion concerto, and she uses like Poltergeist and The Exorcist and all these different films. And there's a moment where someone's like shaking a teapot in the Poltergeist, and the percussionist now has to he's she's notated that rhythm, and the percussionist has to play it in canon with the real teacups and all of these different things. So that's hard to listen to for the average listener, but relevant because we know these films and we can see what you're doing. So it's everything is relevant in a way with a new composer because they are alive right now and they're writing in today's world. So I think as long as people are authentic and they are adapting to the modern life around them, it's modern music is going to, in a sense, be the most relevant of all music.
Yeah, that's certainly a different take on that issue that I have heard as compared to some other people I've talked to, and it's a broad-minded, very interesting take on it, and I appreciate it because there are some orchestras, for example, that um, their concept of relevance is okay. What does my community literally care about? Whatever that they define their community as. And but yeah, you're speaking also in a more global sense. So it's a different. Your perspective much broader, more global. And I think it's neat that there can be such a diversity even in the definition of what's relevant, right? And I part of the reason why I bring it up is because relevance is right now I know is such an important theme for orchestras because for example, the Cincinnati Symphony is striving to be the most relevant orchestra in the country or even in the world or whatever. They've said that in their statements. And yeah, and what does relevance mean in different cities? I mean, some cities or communities have race issues, for example, that are more predominant than in other places. So of course, maybe they might be programming music that has to do with some certain social justice themes or whatever. Whereas in other communities, there are a host of other issues that are um, different in terms of local relevance. Yeah, you talk about very interestingly broader and more universal concepts of relevance. And I guess all I'm ultimately saying here is I appreciate you bringing it up because I think your perspective is not seen as readily in a lot of contexts from what I've seen right now. So, how did you come to that viewpoint? I'm just curious.
Well, I don't know how I came to it, I suppose, but and I don't want to discard the local relevance that you talk about.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, it's good to take a minute to step back and think about what does this word even, what do people even mean, as you said, when they say relevance? It's just a word that gets sort of bandied about. But what does
Mm-hmm.
it actually mean? Because all music is relevant in some way, and you're going to have in any audience, even in Lima, Ohio, or wherever you might be in the world, you're going to have people of different backgrounds, and so something's going to be relevant to someone for whatever reason. But I do agree that you have to find what's happening now in your local communities and address that issue. I think far too many orchestras, and we're finally getting better at this. Um, it took so long for classical music to figure this out. It's just incredible to me because this is an industry full of learned people, for the most part, who read about different time periods, who read about different cultures. It's a generally empathetic, I think, world that we live in. Of course, it can be better, and there are some very bad examples of individuals. And yet, it just took so long because we worship, I think, these pillars of our craft, and
Mhm.
we're sort of living in the past. But I think all art is a is a um, product of what's happening in the world. And honestly, some of the most forgotten art is the art that happens in times which were relatively stable and peaceful. You
Mm,
think about I'm not a huge fan of music from like the Belle Epoque in France or anything like that, when everything was, well, for a certain group of people, was more comfortable than it had been before.
yeah.
It's during wartime and during civil rights movements and things like this where relevance, I think, really comes into play, where art is now not just for casual enjoyment, but it's for it's either abstractly responding to something really intense, or it's intentionally responding to that.
Mm,
So I think that we are in one of those times. Thankfully, we're not in a world war, but there is war on this planet, and there's mass amounts of misery. I mean, and just terrible things going on, and it's a lot of people obviously can get sucked into the pessimism of that. But the good news is, I think things are improving in many ways. But we're living in one of those times that's really fruitful for relevant, quote unquote, music to appear. So yes, you have to listen to your local audience. When I was in Memphis with the Memphis Symphony, that's a town that's pretty much black and white in terms of race. The other races are smaller percentage, but the black population is like 65%.
mhm,
And in the past, the orchestra hadn't reflected that, but now it does. And what that means is the power of music is now reaching more people.
mhm.
But one of the traps you fall into is when you think, oh, let's do. We did a Black History Month concert in Ohio, for example, with three different Black composers. We brought in a poet. We did all. It was a fantastic program. I did an orchestration of a couple Florence Price art songs that are really nice. Um, but you can't just assume that if we build it, they will come.
Mm, yeah.
Just like the tabla concerto I did that from, with an Indian tabla player. In India, Sandeep Das, he's now a Grammy Award winning tabla player, plays with Yo-Yo Ma, Silk Road. In India, he tells them, "Oh, I'm playing with orchestras like the New York Phil." They don't know who the New York Phil is, a lot of people. So they think an orchestra is a little band that you hire at your wedding to play Bollywood songs. And so they think, "Oh, Sandeep, your career is really going down. You're playing with orchestras now." He told me the story. So you can't just
Yeah.
assume that if I put a piece about India on a program that people are going to come flocking to you. So I just encourage people, if you're going to try and bring a new community into the concert hall, it doesn't just happen. You have to go into their community, go see one of their things, because they also have an equally valid art form that's probably centuries old that is more relevant to that group than, oh, God forbid, Beethoven is less relevant to someone than something else. It's just a matter of perspective. And orchestras, they don't really try. They they put the program out there and then they say done, checked off the box.
Mhm.
But that's not really the solution. And a lot of that is comes down to resources and manpower and all of these things. But it's a big topic. But at least we're on the right, moving in the right direction, I think, and asking the right questions now.
Well, I appreciate very much all of the wonderful perspectives you have shared with me today, and particularly what you leave here, which is the idea of where we are currently in 2022 and where are we going. And it sounds like um, certainly there's always a lot of work to do, but it seems like there are some really wonderful things about what you've highlighted about in the industry, and where orchestras are moving in a positive way. So thank you again for talking with me today, and I look forward to seeing more of what you're doing and exciting things you're doing in your career.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.